for joining us for today's Print Month program presented by the IFPDA and Print Council of America. I'm Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. Today we have the third and final program in the series presented by our friends at Print Council of America, Themes and Variations. Before we begin, I'd like to pause for a moment to extend our appreciation to the leadership and members of Print Council of America, especially Mary Weaver Chapin, Deborah Wood, and Shelley Langdale. I couldn't have asked for better partners in the months of planning leading up to these programs. I'm very excited for today's program, Art and the Pull of Print, with Jennifer Roberts, Glenn Adamson, and Andrew Raftery, who will be introduced by our moderator, Shelley Langdale, curator and head of prints and drawings at the National Gallery of Art. First, I'll hand the program over to Mary Weaver Chapin. Mary has once again asked for the briefest of bios. Mary is curator of prints and drawings at the Portland Art Museum and the president of Print Council of America. As a reminder, this program is being recorded and will be available along with all the programs of Print Month on the IFPDA website. If you have questions, and we hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box. We have 360 registered today, so we hope you'll forgive us if we're not able to get to every question. And with that, I turn the program over to Mary. Welcome.
Thank you, Jenny. You'd think after all these practice times doing our introductions, I'd learn how to unmute myself. But here I am and ready to say a big thank you to you and to Sherry Young for your work organizing this really rich selection of lectures for the print audience throughout this month. We are all in your debt. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this, the last of our three presentations of Themes and Variations, topics from Print Council of America. The Print Council of America was founded in 1956 to foster the creation, dissemination, and appreciation of fine prints, old and new. Today, we continue this mission with a membership of approximately 300 curators, scholars, and conservators devoted to the graphic arts. It is a real treat to hand this over now to Shelley Langdale, who is the immediate past president of the Print Council of America and who's done so much for our organization. And she's going to tell you a little bit about the origins of today's talk and how it came together. Shelley is the head of modern prints and drawings at the National Gallery of Art, and she will introduce our speakers. Welcome, Shelley.
Thanks so much, Mary. And I will add my thanks to Jenny Gibbs and Sherry Young for their organizational roles, and also to IFPDA for the phenomenal programs they have put together, particularly for the past 2 years. There's lots to watch in the recordings, and it was great to see the ones that we all could live. But I just thought it would be helpful to speak a little bit about how this program today came to be. Every year, as many people know, we have fantastic annual lectures known as the A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts at the National Gallery of Art. And this year, we had the pleasure of welcoming Jennifer L. Roberts as our 70th annual A.W. Mellon Lecturer. And she, unfortunately, had to present her lectures online, which is not the usual plan. But we were grateful that she did such a beautiful job. They are now lauded as exemplary online presentations. And the unfortunate part was that she had to do them online and therefore could not have questions and answers. So that was why we decided to have the program that we put together today. One of the series of lectures comprises 6 different lectures, and Jennifer used single word, very intriguing single word titles for each: pressure, reversal, separation, strain, interference, and alienation, each of which alludes to a physical and or conceptual aspect of a printmaking process, and were purposely chosen for their multiple implications, about which she will tell you more shortly. So when we were thinking about putting this together for IFDA Print Month, as an ideal forum, as the 360 of you have generously arrived today to participate in this. We knew this was the right space to do this with the print enthusiasts that would be drawn to it. And Jennifer, who is always eager to embrace colleagues across disciplines and fields, thought it would be great to bring in some fellow speakers who could offer additional perspectives on the subject and that would further enhance the discussion. So we are most pleased that Glenn Adamson, renowned in the fields of craft and design, history in particular, and printmaker, print historian Andrew Raftery were excited to join us today. So while many of you hopefully had a chance to watch Jennifer's lectures, we also purposely set things up today so that it's not necessary for you to have done so. But we hope that today's program will encourage you to check them out afterwards, and we will be providing the link to those lectures in the chat. So let me introduce our speakers and get this going. Jennifer L. Roberts is the Elizabeth Cary Agassiz Professor at the Humanities at Harvard University. She is a scholar of American and British art from the 18th century to the present day. Her work approaches the history of art through its intersections with print history, material studies, the theory and practice of making, and the history and philosophy of science. Robert's many publications include Jasper John's Catalog Raisonné of Monotypes from 2017, which he co-authored with print scholar and curator Susan Dackerman. Jasper John's In Press, The Crosshatch Works and the Logic of Print from 2012, and Transporting Visions, The Movement of Images in Early America from 2014. Glenn Adamson is a curator and writer who works at the intersection of craft, design, history, and contemporary art. He has previously been director of the Museum of Arts and Design, head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and curator of the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. His most recent book is Craft, An American History, published by Bloomsbury, and it just came out in 2021, and I encourage you to buy it now. It's a fascinating, fascinating read. Andrew Raftery is an artist specializing in both fictional and autobiographical narrative scenes of contemporary American life. Known for his paintings, Buren engravings, and drawings, Raftery has developed a particular interest in prints for their ubiquitous role in our world, on wallpaper, clothing, and functional objects. His artistic practice is heavily research-based as a curator and collector, and it is both personal and objective, a constant self-reflection informed by historical research on the democratization of mediums. He's also a professor of fine art at the Rhode Island School of Design, and may be known to many of you for his contributions to the wonderful exhibition and catalog, The Brilliant Line, following the early modern engraver 1480 to 1650, organized by Emily Peters and held at the Museum of Art in RISD in 2009. So I will turn things over to Jennifer and Andrew and Glenn, and thank you all for being here today. We're really looking forward to your discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Shelley. I am going to share my screen, although I have a very, very short and simple PowerPoint, but just for a little bit of an orientation to the Mellon lectures. So thanks again, Shelley, and thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to the IFPDA and Print Council. It's such an honor to be here among the true audience of print people. I'm just going to say a few words about the Mellon lectures, and in particular, a little bit of background on why they are the way they are, how they came to be in the format that they came to be in. And I guess I'll start by just saying that I come to print, to the topic of print, from the outside. And in fact, I still feel a little bit like an outsider in groups like this of people who've spent their lives working with and thinking about print. I was not brought up as a print scholar or a print curator. In fact, I had almost no interest in or knowledge about print until about 10 years ago when I stumbled into an opportunity to curate an exhibition about Jasper Johns at the Harvard Art Museum. And as I worked on it, I began to realize that all of Johns's work was ultimately about print, and I was hooked from that point on. So for the past 10 years, I've just been sort of dabbling in writing about print. I've written what you might call a smattering of articles about contemporary artists, modern contemporary artists who work with print. So I've written on Jasper Johns, Corita Kent, Whitley Cole, Ed Ruscha, and I also have a few articles where I'm geeking out about some strange technical pockets of 18th to 20th century print culture, nature printing, ornamental currency engraving, wood engraving, cartographic engraving, this kind of thing. So I have a kind of a wide and somewhat shallow array of thinking about print over the past 10 years. So my work has given me, though, the privilege to meet and talk with artists and printers and master printers. So much of what I have learned about print, I have learned from makers. I've done some printmaking myself, although it's never enough, but even some introductory work in printmaking has been explosively productive for the way I think and write about print. And I also teach a class with Matt Saunders, who's an artist at Harvard called Critical Printing, that has been really formative for the way I think about print. That class is a hybrid studio seminar. So we have 3 hours a week in studio and 3 hours a week in seminar. And we're really trying to experiment with what it would mean to have a truly hybrid pedagogy where students are both scholars and makers of print simultaneously. So as I've been getting into print over the past 10 years, as I've become more and more enchanted with the topic, intellectually and materially, I found myself feeling more and more at odds with my past colleagues in academic studies of modern and contemporary art. I found that outside of a charmed circle of print specialists, there is sometimes at best an indifference and at worst a suspicious or dismissive attitude toward prints and printmaking. I kept finding that print was not being recognized or respected among my colleagues in the way that it seems to me that are obvious to me that it should be. I also kept bumping up against a pedagogical problem, namely that I kept looking for the perfect essay or small paperback volume that I could hand to students on the first day of class that would really quickly awaken them to the astonishing possibilities of thinking about print. I kept looking for something inspirational, conceptually expansive, but anchored in the concrete realities of the printmaking process. And most of all, I kept looking for something that was truly accessible, something that I could hand to an undergraduate in any field and not lose them in jargon or in kind of internal esoteric printmaking debates. And I wasn't finding this kind of text, and this is a kind of constant source of frustration. So when I was invited to give the Mellon lectures by the National Gallery, I realized that I had just been handed this incredible gift of a very broad platform that it seemed to me would be the perfect space to try to address both of these problems at once. It was a rare opportunity to introduce printmaking to an audience that doesn't necessarily already know it and appreciate it. And it was also a rare opportunity to try to turn what I might call my own conversion narrative about print into a book that might find its way into the hands of non-specialist readers. And so I'm currently actually working on converting the manuscript for the book from the Mellon lectures, and in discussion with the publishers, I'm very pleased that they've agreed that this should be a very slender paperback volume. It'll come out straight out in paperback. And I'm writing it and positioning it so that hopefully it's something that can be assigned in classes, can be easily accessible and read by a wide variety of people who might be interested in print. So those fundamentally were my hopes for the Mellon lectures, to try to legitimize the medium for communities that don't necessarily recognize it already, to make it meaningful and powerful in more territories, to make it visible, essentially kind of clearing new paths of access to print, attaching, as I like to say, receptors to it so that it can be recognized in new kinds of communities. And so I had come to the conclusion as I started working on these lectures that the best way to do this was to come at print from an unorthodox direction, to talk about it in a different way, to attend to things about it that are less commonly recognized as its sort of fundamental axes of significance. So what I chose to do, and this explains the kind of mysterious single word lecture titles that I decided to use for these lectures, I decided to focus not on the traditional ways of breaking up print, say into etching and lithography and so forth, but rather on a series of what I like to think of as more primordial physical operations or maneuvers that are characteristic of printmaking, but that also create certain kinds of ways of connecting those printmaking operations, both with other media and also with broader conceptual ideas in and around the culture. So I divided my lectures into these 6 titles: pressure, reversal, separation. Separation is fundamentally about color separation. Strain is a lecture that's largely about screen printing, but also other stencil methods. Interference, that's largely about the interference that can erupt as images move between different syntaxes. And it's especially about the moire effect. And then alienation, the last lecture, is about all the ways that print is about estrangement and belatedness and discontinuity and sort of letting go, as well as making contact. And these lectures are not about reproduction. I decided to bracket that theme out because I feel that the overemphasis on reproductivity in print studies over the past really 50 years, I would say, while very important, has tended to become a little too familiar of a narrative. It's lost some of the strangeness that I see as being productive and interesting about printmaking. So I wanted to open up other ways of thinking about print, but the hope is, and we'll talk about this a little bit today, I hope, is to be able to return to narratives of reproduction and replication from a new perspective. So I'm essentially trying to attach a set of new metaphors to printmaking and to see where those metaphors can take us and how we can connect print to other fields and ideas. Now, a sub-argument in all of this is, for me, the importance of making as a form of knowledge, the importance of the knowledge that printmakers have, and the importance of bringing that knowledge into the broader realm of history and theory and discussion. So what do printmakers know that we all need to know about print, and how can we make those more central to the way we think about the medium? And this is one of the reasons that I'm so thrilled to have Glenn and Andrew with me today, just to talk through some of these questions. Both Glenn and Andrew work at the intersection of making and history, criticism, theory. Both of them know more than I do about most of the important topics in these lectures. They've both been enormously important to my own thinking over the past few years. Andrew is a printmaker and an artist who makes things in order to make them, but also to know them and also to understand them as a form of historical research. And Glenn is really probably the preeminent theorist of making and craft working today. So I'm thrilled to have you both here, and I will unshare my screen and we can begin, I believe. All right. So I think one of the first topics that we had discussed the other day when we were thinking about this panel is, how do we launch from a discussion of print that brackets out questions of reproduction in order to focus on making? How do we then return to the question of reproduction? How do we bring craft and reproduction together in our discussions? So I thought we might just start by talking a little bit about what reproduction means after having bracketed out for this discussion.
Yeah, so maybe I could start with that, if that's okay, Jennifer, and that's great, a great pleasure to be with you. And I have this kind of weird double consciousness now when we talk, because we've known each other since I think the mid-90s. Yeah. And yet now I have this kind of weird like starstruckness because the lectures were that good. So like old friend who also has just delivered this unbelievable intellectual enfilade. And if by any wild chance there's anybody in the audience that hasn't seen the lectures, you must, and not just because of what Jennifer's been able to do in opening up this medium and discipline, but also because, as Shelley said, they are exemplary as a form. And I think there's a whole other conversation that I would love to have with you, Jennifer, in some public situation where we talk about how you even practically achieved those lectures, and then what the format that you devised allows us to do as art historians that really is new. And it's funny because Shelley said it was unfortunate that you couldn't do the lectures in person, but actually I think the necessity of delivering them online pushed you to do something vastly more innovative, and it's kind of a silver lining of the circumstance. So anyway, they're just phenomenal. I think when we consider what those lectures can do for us when returning to this fundamental question of replication or reproduction, you know, a lot of the answer is really in the title of the lectures. So you'll have noticed out there that Jennifer's used two physical terms, contact and pull, in the titling. And also, of course, the titles of the lectures themselves are physical words. So they are metaphors, but they're also tangible processes. And I think the big takeaway for me when returning to this fundamental issue of replication is that replication is not the kind of transparent, automated phenomenon that it's often taken to be, probably more in photography and film studies actually than in print studies, where I think this kind of residual physicality has often been acknowledged. But you know, if we go back to the kind of lodestone of thinking in this area, which is of course Walter Benjamin's essay on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which I think I was asked to read in 3 separate classes as a first year undergraduate, you know, his assumption there is that there's a direct opposition between the auratic, unique artwork, which is a product of physical craft, and that the reproduced artwork, and this is of course why he and many of his generation were excited about it as a sort of modern possibility, had a non-auratic, to some extent dematerialized, but certainly kind of frictionless relationship to society and to materiality.
Right.
What you're showing us is that that's not the case. It's a topic I had actually approached myself from a separate point of view when thinking about the question of handmade copies. And it occurred to me at some point that if you wanted to test the skill of a population of craftspeople, let's get away from printmaking for a second, and let's imagine we wanted everyone in that population of craftspeople to make a chair. The way that you probably would construct your examination would be to give them all a chair and ask them to copy it, and whoever could come closest would be your best craftsperson. And of course, that is exactly the situation that prevailed in the 18th century. Chair makers created sets of 8 or 12 or 20 chairs, and they all had to match one another. And the way that you knew whether somebody was a good craftspeople was whether they could do that. And because of the various transformative relationships between industry and craft that started shortly after that in the Industrial Revolution, of course, craft acquired the opposite set of expectation that was in fact about uniqueness and possibly expression, a certain kind of gesturalism in making.
Yeah.
But that, to my mind, occludes a kind of fundamental historical condition for craft, that it is not only compatible with, but also the means by which replication occurs. And what you're showing us is that that Benjaminian opposition between the unique and auratic and the frictionless and reproductive is actually a vast terrain of specific conditions. And I would just, last thing I'll say in this first little bit of our conversation is that there's a point in the interference talk where you very briefly, but in a kind of fantastic way, say, and I'm just going to talk about reproduction just for 2 minutes here, and point out that all the photographs that we see in visual culture of the 20th and indeed 21st century are not photographs, they're prints in magazines, in newspapers, on signage, et cetera, and they actually have all of these very particular qualities that are derived from the technologies and indeed the crafts that are used to make them. And so to really cope with them as visual constructs, we need to know about those processes. And then there's also a wonderful kind of undertow throughout the lectures where you're showing how artists, particularly at the moment that those conditions become invisible or sort of fall below the radar of public notice, those are exactly the moments that artists tend to kind of latch onto and pull out. So, you know, whether it's Mark Bradford or Sigmar Polka, there's often a kind of voicing, or indeed Johns and Rauschenberg, there's a kind of voicing and a making explicit of those underlying conditions that draws your attention to the work that's being done in those visual texts. And that seems to be a big part of the job of contemporary art, as it engages with questions of print and reproduction, two related issues.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm glad that you noticed that little moment about photography, because that's something that I really want to work more on in the future. And it's a kind of mystery that continue to pop up in my scholarship, is the very close and very complicated relationship between print and photography. I mean, most of our thinking around photography today, most of our thinking about reproduction and mass reproduction is attached to photography, including most of our thinking about indexicality is attached to photography. And it's really seen as this master medium. But the more I've learned about print, particularly commercial print methods in the later 19th century and the 20th century, the more it's become clear to me that print and photography are drawing upon each other constantly. It's a kind of symbiotic relationship where print needs photography to do certain kinds of things like rescaling, for example, but photography is totally dependent on print methods for the actual mass reproduction of its imagery for many, many years. So that's one of the future topics that I hope these lectures might open up, might kind of create a territory for people to explore more fully, because there's so much work to be done there. And I've been very interested throughout these lectures in the way perhaps the goal of a print process is reproduction, the main goal, but there are so many side effects to reproduction that go through the body of the printmaker, that flow through the print shop. There are so many things that you have to do and ways that you have to be able to think in order to produce a reproduction, so that all of the ways in which you have to think in reverse, you have to turn images inside out in your mind, you've got to take them apart and put them back together, all of these other aspects of print, which may initially have been side effects of a reproductive urge, have their own qualities that can then be transferred elsewhere. And this is something that Johns spoke a lot about himself, is that and especially now when we don't need print to be reproductive in quite the same way that we used to, these side effects can now become the main goals of the process, and maybe reproduction is a side effect. I'd be curious, Andrew, to hear from you about, in your work, to what extent the reproductivity of, say, line engraving is important to you as you're working.
Well, it's a very fraught thing because, of course, there's the whole question of function. And so lithography may have been used by Delacroix and Redon for art prints, but it was also used much more widely for maps and book illustration and posters, stone lithography, let's say, and we just don't use it that way anymore. And so there's this kind of sense that maybe something has been lost, because it's not that the need for those reproduction has changed, it's just that now we're often looking at things on phones and computers rather than on pieces of paper even. So I think it's really, and that's really, I think Anthony Griffiths comes to that point in his printmaking before photography, where that's why he stops where he stops. And Ivan certainly had that technological determinism that sort of said etching was over. And I think it's just when, once the print becomes a work of art, once the lithograph or engraving becomes a work of art, then I think the question is to think about the character of that work. And I like to think of the work of art itself as having the particular characteristic is that there's the matrix, and then there's every print that's pulled from that matrix. And that pile next to the matrix is the full work of art.
Yes.
And that's unlike most other kinds of works of art, except for things that happen in editions. And then the other thing that's so remarkable is that those things are never together again. Like that you would know that they'll never be reunited, and they are slowly feeding out into the world and getting farther and farther apart as they go out in the world, and have this almost, what I always think is a kind of survival mechanism, that a print can be in Kansas and London at the same time and still be part of that one giant work of art.
Yeah, that's so true. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about too, with when you really start thinking about print materially, when you refuse the dematerialization narrative that we've inherited, you do think of the work as what the theorist Timothy Morton calls a hyper object. It's an object that exceeds any clear set of boundaries. So, you know, you think of all the ink that goes into any edition, you think of all of those piles of paper, and then they're moving around the world sort of like a geological process almost. I find that that kind of material view of print is also a way to help students relate to print, students who are interested in eco-criticism and questions of global transmission. They're very interested in thinking about just the mass of material that a print represents, and that a print is actually much heavier and more material than something like a single painting is in that respect.
Yeah, there's also a counterintuitive thing there. Just thinking about your pile and its, you know, the way that the artwork gets alienated from itself, to use your term, Jennifer, and that kind of distribution. What you realize is that that process of hyper objectification is what happens, for example, on Instagram. And insofar as Instagram is now becoming the primary platform for the art world to do its business, in fact, the art object in general is, through this digital mechanism, approaching the condition that print already always existed in. And obviously take a lot more thought, but I think a lot about ceramics and the way that ceramics perform on digital platforms, which in many ways seems antithetical to the whole point of a ceramic, which is, you know, whatever, functionality, etc. But actually there's an enormous precedent there in the condition of print as it's existed historically, that we could understand as a kind of conceptual armature for understanding the way that artwork is now engaging with these new means of mass reproduction.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so I'm trying to keep track of the time here. We have so little time. I wanted to talk all about ceramics too, but okay. The next thing that we wanted to make sure to talk a little bit about was the question of print's relationship to other media. We were all sorry to have missed Susan Talman's presentation on Tuesday on print in the expanded field, but I had to teach, Andrew had to teach. So we haven't seen that video yet, but this is a very live conversation, and part of my lectures is thinking about how does print relate to other media, often more prestigious media, but also perhaps other kinds of invisible media in the art world. And I thought we might start just with, I wanted to ask you a question, Glenn. We have known each other since the 90s, and we both went to Yale. We both had this sort of same disciplinary background, very much interested. We're both Brown students and interested in materiality and making and craft. And as I like to say, I got my PhD at Yale without knowing anything about print at all. Nobody taught me the difference between a lithograph and a wood engraving. It just was not part of the curriculum. You have gone on to distinguish yourself as someone who thinks about the intersection between craft and reproduction. So you're so good at talking about making and copying and reproduction, and yet you've never really worked on print or printmaking in the past. And I'm so curious about why you think that is. It's something that I'm always thinking about, is how has print fallen into a blind spot among some communities, some scholarly communities. You know, it was certainly in my blind spot for many, many years. And if it weren't for Jasper Johns, I don't know if I'd be here today.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I had been thinking about it already, but only because of your lectures. And to be honest, it was a blind spot that persisted in my thinking all the way up until this year. So that's pretty blind. Because as you say, and as the lectures abundantly demonstrate, this is a topic that is so in my area of interest. And so I have to ask myself, how could I have been so obtuse not to have kind of gone on a parallel journey to the one you've gone on? And all I can say is that when we were at Yale, they still had slides, and there was a slide library, and the things that I thought I was interested in were literally in their own cabinet that said minor arts at the top.
Yeah.
And it didn't include prints. That it was a different cabinet.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that's in a way a kind of stupid example, but it is telling, because I think there are disciplinary formations that you encounter quite early on in your career that in a way tell you what your responsibilities are and how that indexes to a certain territory. And I think probably there was also a level of being either intimidated or respectful of the level of commitment that really understanding print would involve, which obviously you can now attest to, because it is a very complex field with a significant literature of its own. But I think, to be honest, it was more to do with a certain kind of fissure between the fine and decorative arts that actually print fits into, but not in a way that I could see before.
Interesting.
And what I think the interesting takeaway right now for the 21st century, now that we're all congratulating ourselves for being so cross-disciplinary, is that that's great, and that kind of fluidity and self-permission to travel everywhere in the way that prints themselves do, as we were just talking about. But I think that there's also that quality of responsibility is still there. So to understand media in relation to one another without forgetting the things that make that each medium a valid and unique contributor to that conversation, not only to think about the lateral motion, as exciting as that is, but also to think about the way that each of these physical processes anchors the processes of meaning construction.
So Glenn, when I first met you, you gave a talk based on Art in the Making, the book you wrote with Julia Brown-Wilson. And I was sitting all the way through the talk thinking, Prince did that 500 years ago. We've been doing it all along, all those issues of collaboration and those levels of authorship. I thought really, yes, your thinking had so much to do with Prince. But I've also found that there is something that can be a little intimidating about Prince, and this sort of idea that people coming to Prince feel like they have to have this preloaded knowledge about what it is, and this whole trying to understand the issue of reproduction and originality. And working with printed ceramics and wallpaper has been a very different experience. I have found that it's much more approachable for an audience just to take it on as a plate or a decorative pattern and then enter the content in a different way. So it's definitely something as a culture we have to deal with in prints. I think to help people to understand what it is they're looking at. And that's what I was trying to do with the Brilliant Line educational materials, to give people some tools to enter little black and white prints of religious and mythological subjects.
No, I've had the pleasure of being a visiting critic in your department at RISD. And one of the things that most surprised me when I got there was how many people were doing things that weren't print in your printmaking department. There's a lot of printmaking happening as well, but you're actually, I suppose, exemplifying the elasticity of the kind of creative possibilities that we're just talking about. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this idea of printmaking in relation to other media actually works in a live pedagogical context at RISD.
Well, I would say in our program, even though it's not always evident, they're all really making prints all the time. And one of the things that came really clear to me from Jennifer's lectures is that pedagogically, when we're introducing students to printmaking, the syllabus might say lithography or an engraving, but we're intellectually trying to introduce them those ideas of reversal, separation, alienation. That's not on the syllabus. But as they're putting the blankets over the plate and not seeing the thing as it's actually being made, all those kind of deep concepts come through, and I think really change their attitudes towards making. So when artists who have been deeply trained in that and actually internalized those types of procedures work with other media, I think we can really look closely and see that. And I think that is part of our discourse too. Those are the kinds of things that we share and have as our kind of background. And Jennifer just brought it more to the foreground, I think, and brought a way of thinking about it that I thought was really powerful. And actually, as a pedagogical tool, is really powerful.
Yeah, I think that that's very gratifying to hear, because if nothing else, those lectures are trying to take the walls down from around the print community, and the sense that there is this kind of intimidating technical knowledge that one has to overcome. There's a sense that the print world is closed off to the rest of the art historical world. And I just say that as someone who, has long been kind of outside of the print world and had that perception myself. And one of the things I was trying to do with those topics, those 6 topics, was again, find the core of printmaking, or a set of operations within printmaking that actually do connect outside of the medium. And so I'm actually not so much interested in the print medium as the unit of analysis. I think what I've been trying to do is to get down below the medium, looking at print as a kind of bundle of smaller physical and cognitive operations like reversal and pressure and so forth. Print is a particular kind of bundle of those operations, some of which are in other media, and all of which can build connections to conceptual structures in particular ways. So what I think I'm trying to do is sort of break the shell of the print medium and get down into a kind of more granular physical level that does transit across these mediums. So I think that's also why I spent so much time talking about what we would normally call painting in the lectures, or photography or sculpture. When I look out at contemporary art, I see print everywhere. And I don't see people recognizing that. So Glenn Lagan is thought to be a painter, but I honestly believe that almost everything he does is print one way or another. And we've already talked about photography, but when we talk about an expanded field and thinking about print as an expanded field, for me, it doesn't mean let's take print and move it out. I see it as just let's recognize what's already out there. We're surrounded by print that we just don't see. And in my lectures, I talk a lot I complain about Warhol being classified as a painter and his paintings as being classified as paintings, when I think they're just pretty much straight screen prints. So yeah.
The other example of that would be the many connections you illustrate between printmaking and textiles, particularly in the silkscreen lecture and the strain lecture.
Yeah.
What's fascinating to notice there, and again, this is more of a general methodological point that I've taken away from the lectures, is that paradoxically, it's when you get down to that physical granular level that you discover a conceptual framework that actually is transportable to another medium. So then once having absorbed the idea of strain or interference, I can then take that set of ideas and the questions that are contained within them to another medium and pose them there, and then see. So that's what I was trying to talk about earlier when I was saying that the respect for the physicality of each medium is what actually makes the cross-disciplinary maneuver worthwhile.
Right. That's the hope. Okay, so it's already 12:45, and we wanted to end by, the Mellon lectures themselves are about contemporary art, but we wanted to end with a nod to traditional sort of older print media. And we thought that we could have Andrew put up some images of one of his recent works, not that recent now, I guess, but of course, Andrew works in copperplate line engraving. And we wanted to talk about how the lectures and this new perspective on print doesn't by any means imply leaving the past behind or any kind of disregard for traditional methods, rather vice versa. So Andrew, would you like to just quickly
say a few words? So this is a print that I finished 2008 from a series called Open House, about real estate open houses. And one thing I notice about it now, even just looking at it, even if I made it, is that when you see it, it seems somehow inevitable. And I just wanted to say that doing engraving, it takes all these steps to kind of get to the point where you're ready. because this kind of engraving, you're always doing something. So I work it out with sculpture, drawings, do a final drawing that holds everything together in line, and do a tonal study. And it's only then that I can start on the plate. So when I get to the plate, I'm back to the beginning. And when I'm working on that plate, it is the whole world, quite simply. And I think the question is, what am I thinking about while I'm working on this plate? And I'm thinking really about every single line and its relationship to the other lines, all of the other lines that are going to be on the plate until I get to that very last line and it's finished. I'm thinking about the relationship between the black and the white. And I'm thinking about my subject and how the details reach a certain amount of clarity to really express that subject itself. I have to admit, I'm not thinking about the things like that Jennifer mentions that much, but they are there in the background. They're part of the sort of subtext of what's going to happen with the print. And I also think about things in Glenn's work, and certainly the whole idea of production methods in art and the making, and how those very, very much determine somehow the nature of a work of art and its sort of place in our world. So I think about that. And then I also do think, when dealing with an older method, about the idea of nostalgia and sentimentality, and this sort of idea of being a maker of things in this way during the era that we live in now. And I think Glenn's work has a very kind of salutary warnings against that sort of thing for craft, for anybody who's involved deeply in craft. And yet I do see my work as a real resistance in the face of algorithms and consumerism and kind of cultural commodities in that sort of way. It's something that really gives me this opportunity to make something entirely from beginning to end that really makes a statement about our own time. Using these means and really working, in this case, straight out of the work of Claude Mellon, and sort of taking a 17th century artist and using that language to express something for today.
I so enjoyed revisiting these images the other day, rereading Jonathan Weinberg's essay about them. And I'm so struck by how even though you're returning to the Claude Mellon and to this much earlier mode of incision and transfer of images, that there's also, the subject matter is real estate. It's about making a home into an image to be sold. It's about the sort of transfer of commodities, and it's also made just on the cusp of the real estate crash in 2008. And so this is a process that you've been working in, a process that's associated with tradition and value and authenticity for subject matter that's about a kind of failure of that authenticity, a mismatch between value and reality. And I'm just so struck by the relationship between your work in line engraving and things like security engraving and currency engraving. In the 19th century, paper money engraving was associated with paper money, which was a kind of loss of value, something less substantial than real gold or silver. But now we're in a situation where an engraved certificate really is seen to be truly authentic and real, as opposed to certain kinds of digital transactions. And so it's almost as if engraving has deepened its hold, its cut on reality and authenticity in contemporary life. And I love the way your prints really balance right at that edge between the way we now see engraving as a material. We're able to see it as a material, authentic operation in a way that it wasn't possible to do so earlier. So I see those as very much related to currency engraving, which again is one of my favorite topics. But yeah.
There's something there about indexicality. It makes me think about the relationship between currency engraving and engraving a key or a dog, like a dog tag, for an actual dog, and that's maybe a moment that everyday the everyday citizen actually encounters engraving, even if
Yep.
it's mechanized. But I was just also thinking, Andrew, about those real estate works as kind of Hogarthian in their effect, you know, of creating a kind of distance from the social phenomenon, so they could be held up for a kind of examination, although not with the moralizing judgment that Hogarth tended to bring to his subjects. It seems like a more kind of permissive and curious state of mind that you're bringing to us. But I think, you know, there's a way in which craft often is talked about as either a holding action, as you said, a kind of resistance against other forms of technology and making, and an insistence on the retention of older skills or ways of doing things. So it's often positioned that way, or it's instead positioned as a kind of experimental operation, which could be the case in industrial design prototyping, or could be the case in a fine art context, certainly. And one of the things that I always like to try to remember is that both of those things can happen simultaneously, so that you can have it's again that word pull, right? The sort of pulling in two directions at once, both pulling historical potentialities into the present, and also pulling a kind of futurity into the present from the other direction. And craft has so much space in it, which in a way is anchored by the simple sense of wonder that somebody might have when looking at one of your prints. You know, how in the world could he have done this? That kind of reaction that feels quite simple. But I think what's happening there is that a conceptual space is opening up where all of those different temporalities and potentialities can happen simultaneously, and you get some really great internal dialectical energy as a result of that. And I think a handcrafted work is really, really good at generating that kind of internal complexity, simply because it both is and also communicates itself as an object in which a great deal of time and human affect has been invested, so that it can sort of hold all that richness within itself.
Yeah. It's an object of care. Okay, I know we need to
I know we could do this probably 4 times over. And thank you all for your really fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. We do have some questions, and one thing I want to throw in before we go too far from Andrew's the images he just shared and spoke about, because one of the things that struck me, Jennifer, too, about I think there is a lot more to do with the exploration of the relationship between photography and printmaking, because one of the things that I also think is so fascinating now that we're into the digital age and the whole issue of photographs being printed digitally, prints being printed digitally, and initially the whole phenomenon of artists and printmakers often working in woodcut or some other medium and then printing them digitally is almost the reverse of what you had with photography and the line engraving that you were talking about at the end of the 19th century, where photos were being transferred onto wood blocks and then carved and then printed. So there's such a dynamic relationship that is continuing to this day as new technologies evolve. So there's a lot more. We could have a whole discussion just on that. But I did want to share some of the questions and comments that came up. For Andrew, Elizabeth Rudy asks, first, she thanks everyone for this wonderful discussion. And Andrew, I was struck by your description of the full work, i.e. an entire edition, and the matrix being the print. Have you thought about this idea, how this idea might be explicitly visible or tangible in the context of an exhibition space?
Certainly it's something, there could be a more performative type of exhibition that would actually involve making the edition, but it is something that, I'm sure Jennifer saw going to those print shops. Just that sort of the layers going on, the prints being assembled, the artists signing the prints, and then, having them dispersed. It does happen all the time in print publishers and print shops. And maybe that is something that could be more culturally available, sort of seeing more about how that actually happens, or getting more insight into that point of making.
Well, and sort of how to convey that when someone is engaging with a print in an exhibition space is interesting to think about, because in a funny way too, that does relate to time-based media issues. I think Christiane's thought a lot about that. Christiane Baumgartner, who also Jennifer has spoken about in her lectures, because that is an interesting thing to think. Just like television or an Instagram post, there are people across the world viewing this at the same time in different spaces and contexts.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be interesting to do, I think you could do an exhibition where someone makes a print or makes an edition, and then it's the first time it's shown, it's the whole edition stacked there, the empty ink, the empty ink containers, all the materials that went into it, as many of them that can be expressed spatially. There's all kinds of ways this could be an installation or a performance, have the artist sitting there and signing the prints in the gallery. It would make sense with the way contemporary art is shown. So Elizabeth will talk about that.
Well, and we need to be careful here, because we have been very focused on contemporary printmaking. And of course, old master prints were not made in set editions all at once very often. They were often printed over time as needed or as there was interest in acquiring them. So those differences also are very important to make explicit in exhibitions and when we're talking about all of this.
Right. And the whole question of how you put a boundary around an edition, like what's in it and what's out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here's another question, and Jennifer, you might have to, I don't know if we have time, but you might have to provide a little bit of context. We have a question. In your Mellon lectures, you mentioned Bruno Latour as an important influence on your thinking. Could you say a bit about, particularly as it relates to prints and printmaking?
Well, that's a great question. So I came to printmaking and to this interest from years of teaching thing theory and material theory, trying to get students to think about the material qualities of artworks and the agency of materials, the history of materials. And this is a recognized subfield now in many different fields in the humanities and the sciences. And Latour has just been a lodestone for me in thinking about how we understand what materials can say to us, what kind of agency they have in the construction of the meaning of a work. And in my lecture, I mostly bring him in to help us think about why we should care about the screen mesh and screen printing, and why this mesh does have a history, and why there's this whole history of kind of gestural acts of straining and sifting that lie behind screen printing. So, Latour's very good about talking about the way humans over the history of humanity have entered into certain kinds of collaborations with materials and technologies, and that everything we make is based on an interaction between a human historical culture and a set of materials and technologies. And so this just strikes me as something that's highly relevant when we're thinking about print, which is at this intersection between the handmade and the technical, between the human and the machine. I'm very interested in that seam. So it's one of the reasons that I'm surprised that print isn't discussed more often in contemporary graduate seminars, which are full of discussions about materiality and the agency of matter. So I think that was intended to be a kind of hint to my graduate school colleagues to bring print into that discussion.
Well, we have reached the bewitching hour of 1 o'clock, and I know that some of our panelists have to go teach and have other responsibilities they have to get to. So I want to thank you all for lots of food for further thought. And a thank you to Mary and Deb, Mary Chapin and Deb and to the Print Council for hosting us, and to the IFPDA. And I'm going to turn things over to Jenny.
Thank you, Shelley. And thank you, Jennifer, Andrew, and Glenn. That was amazing. And thank you to everyone who joined us today and who has been with us throughout this month of programs. Tomorrow is the last program of Print Month, and we're going out, I think, on a high note with a program presented by IPCNY, Breaking Ground, Pattern and Print with artist Joyce Kozloff, who is featured on the cover of the current issue of Art Forum, and master printer and wearer of hats, Judith Solotkin, founder of Solo Impression. We hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.